Okay, so I will just get started. Welcome to session 15, Renewal through Institutional Reconciliation, and your next social justice project, How Archives Are Reinventing Student-Centeredness, presented by Dr. Harrison Wick, Special Collections Librarian and University Archivist at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, Amber Lawrence, former graduate student at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and Brother Joshua Waits, Seminary Archivist at the Virginia Theological Seminary. And I am your moderator, Jacqueline Deppy. As a reminder, this session will be recorded, and we will be utilizing the live transcript for this session for accessibility purposes. If you would like to hide the subtitles, simply click the live transcription button at the bottom of your application and then select Hide Subtitle. And if your Zoom application is not maximized, you may need to click on the three dots or the More icon to turn off the subtitles. Please use the Q&A feature to pose any questions to the panel, and I will relay those questions to the panelists to close out the session. As a reminder, Merrick does not tolerate harassment in any form. Merrick is committed to providing a harassment-free environment for its members and others who participate in its conferences, events, meetings, formal mentoring relationships, and online spaces, regardless of age, color, creed, disability, family relationship, gender, identity and expression, individual lifestyle, marital status, national origin, physical appearance, race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, or veteran status. Please make yourself familiar with the code of conduct, and please make sure to visit our pre-recorded poster presentations on YouTube. Links for these items will appear in the chat. And now we can go ahead and get started with the session.
Thank you, Jacqueline. It's a pleasure to meet all of you virtually. And thank you for joining us. I am Harrison Wick, the Special Collections Librarian, University Archivist at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. I've been there since 2007. Indiana, PA is the home of Jimmy Stewart. Today, I wanted to talk with you about reconciliation through discovery and IUP's social justice project. So I'm going to be, I'll lead this discussion, and then my co-presenter, Amber Lawrence, will pick up afterwards. So I wanted to emphasize how our social justice project would not have been possible without the work of Amber Lawrence, who a recent graduate from IUP, and she worked in special collections for more than 2 years. The work that she has done has been incredible in building an inventory that helped us create a controlled vocabulary that we've used to create the Social Justice Project as an archival collection. And it's been a lot of fun to work on this project and humbling as well. It's very nice to be able to share with you the results of this project and how it's changed special collections as well as the resources that we share with everyone else. I want to talk to you a little bit about the 4 types of collections that we investigated in using the Social Justice Project. So right now, we answer about 1,300 research requests a year, and this involves all 4 areas. Record groups are institutional history of IUP, and those reflect not only buildings and grounds, but campus offices and departments dating back to the 1870s. We actually have a complete record of the trustees from 1871 to the present. And all of these collections have been reviewed by our controlled vocabulary that we're using for the Social Justice Project. And it's been very rewarding. We've been able to discover in manuscript groups and record groups a lot of different material related to African Americans, LGBTQIA plus communities, as well as Native Americans. And these are a lot of things that we'll be talking about, Amber will talk about as well. The manuscript groups really reflect collections outside of the institutional history of IUP. These include strengths include the papers of individuals and businesses, organizations, unions, including the United Mine Workers of America, District 2. and coal mining companies, as well as steel and a lot of great variety of collections that are used by our researchers every day. Especially interesting in this project has been the Pennsylvania and the Rare Book Collection and our regional history collection. And these books are about 20,000 titles and reflect a lot of the manuscript groups that we have, including coal mining and the steel industry and labor relations. So it's been a lot of fun to work with our resources, and the challenge is to try to make the social justice project as all-encompassing as possible, and that's where Amber and our current students are working on. And that lets me talk about Record Group 148, the IUP Social Justice Project. And this is just one of the window displays we put up on campus to talk about what we've found, photographs in publications, many different resources that people just, I don't know, it's hard to explain. In a lot of ways, social justice is one of those projects that if you don't have a social justice project, it can just always be in the background. It's something that a lot of people, uh, not because they've wanted to not include social justice, it's just that it's one of those priorities that people sometimes just don't think of. And that's why I've always believed that you have to be very proactive in looking for resources like this. If anything, it can help your marketing department. It can help social justice offices that such as Title IX, or our Title IX coordinator. We also have many other departments on campus that were interested in the history on campus, and we were able to provide images that we have found in publications. And there's so many different varieties of that's what I love about this project, which started as an internship with Amber, and now it has become a collection that continues to surprise us and find new materials. And it's very rewarding. It really is. So the IUP Social Justice Project started with finding our first students. And I wanted to introduce you to Bianca Parker and Helen Dixon. Bianca Parker was a student at IUP Indiana State Normal School in the 1892 and 1893. She attended courses. Her family was, her father was a former escaped slave. They lived in Ripley, Ohio. And Bianca was on campus, but was not living in the dorms at the time. And Helen Dixon graduated the class in 1926. And Helen did, I want to point out that she did not live on campus, but she lived in the community and lived in a house not far from campus that was campus owned. And Helen graduated with the class in 1926 from Indiana State Normal School before we became Indiana State Teachers College. On the right, we have one of our first groups of international students on campus, and this was from the 1960 yearbook. So I've always found it interesting how, and it's important to use controlled vocabulary because we can really think about words that we would use today that would be more appropriate. For example, you'll see under that caption for the international students that they refer to them as foreign students on campus. Well, that in certain connotation can be xenophobic in some ways. So, the important thing is to remember that we have to use terms that are searchable and socially acceptable today, but also at the same time, look for controlled vocabulary that will help find resources in publications that are online. So, I mean, we have to look for foreign students. We have to look for, if we're looking for African American students, we're not necessarily going to find them under the terminology of African American. But we have to remember that to find our first students, we have to use controlled vocabulary to be able to look for other resources. And this goes to, we've used this method to look at not only photographs, but publications, the record groups of the collections. We've been able to really focus on looking through the documents themselves. A lot of these early images, on the right, we have an article from our IUP magazine of two women who lived on campus in the 1950s, and they were talking about their experiences. And these are excellent opportunities to be able to share with everyone about you know, who we can find, who you can find in a social justice project. And it's been very rewarding for us too. I mean, it really helps understand the limitations to archives, as well as what you can discover in your resources to be more helpful to everyone else in your research. And a lot of these photographs and publications, and I want to point out that our IUP publications, including this article in the IUP magazine, are available on our website. But the important thing is that short of browsing to find these images, I mean, the Social Justice Project has helped us be able to say, well, this article is in the 2001 IUP magazine. And that work was made possible by Amber Lawrence. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the university resources to consider. There's many, many different places to go. I mean, I was asked recently how many archival materials there are, and I figured out that the IUP Special Collections and University Archives, the record groups and manuscript groups, if I laid them all one box high, they would take up 4 football fields of space. And that's a lot of resources, I have to tell you. And these include publications, student works, newsletters, magazines, promotional materials, even our yearbooks. And it's important to really consider when really thinking about a social justice project, start with controlled vocabulary, but you have to remember that those keywords that you're looking for in documentation are going to change and grow. And when looking at your record groups and manuscript groups, you'll find that you're going to run into handwritten documents, printed documents. So, you want to help train your students to be able to look for keywords and also be able to find resources that they may not necessarily be looking for. And that's where the the controlled vocabulary using keywords can help us, and that can grow and evolve over time. Photographs are going to be you're going to have an unlimited number of photographs to consider. The images we found of Bianca Parker and Helen Dixon, we had to kind of go in reverse order. We knew that Bianca Parker was our first African American student, but we didn't have a photograph of her because our early catalogs and yearbooks just didn't have photographs in the 1890s. So we went through Kimball Union Academy, and we're able to find a photograph of her from their alumni directory. And that's how we found her in our catalogs and other records. We also have many other databases to consider: Access Newspaper Archive, as well as genealogy websites and sources. But you always want to consider the legacy collections that you have and think about we need to be proactive in looking for resources that are new resources that we can consider for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we need to promote those materials on campus in displays and exhibits and learn to engage with our students and employees. We have found many different collections that celebrate diversity on campus, and these were incorporated into the Social Justice Project. The Star of David, that belonged to Fernand Fizel, who was a French professor that who's when I started IUP, he was still teaching, and Fernand passed away in 2010. And this star belonged to his sister who died during the Holocaust. We also have a picture here of Dr. Patricia Hillard Robertson, who was IUP's astronaut. And this is a picture of her in the Vomit Comet and during training for in suborbit conditions and weightless conditions. In the middle, we have I have an image of a diary that belonged to Balua Johns, who was a nurse in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And we have all of her service diaries. On the right, we have a postcard that was signed by Jackie Robinson. And this is part of a collection that we received from J. Neil Griffith, who was a community member who collected autographs on postcards and received them, and we have over 1,500 of his postcards, and it's interesting to be able to. You don't think of that as very archival, but I have to tell you, it's interesting. It's fun for people to see in displays, and we have all kinds of different artifacts that we can talk about with those too. And not to mention, and I want to emphasize the importance of audio video records, and I'll get into that in a little more detail, but especially the oral history interviews that we've been able to digitize. There are many collections to consider. So just talking about athletics, we've started to work on a variety of projects to look for diversity, equity, and inclusion in not only photographs, but games and programming from athletics, including football, basketball, the video collection of IUP, and the dance and performance. And this has led to some interesting discoveries. I mean, down on the left, you'll see our U-matic tapes. I found over 700 U-matic videotapes. And then as the Social Justice Project really has materialized, I made a real commitment to do a survey of all of our audio video materials, which are in danger of obsolescence. And I want to talk to you a little bit about outreach and how we can work together to find new resources for outreach, for us to really engage with our students in the community and talk about social justice. So the University Museum is an excellent way to talk and engage with students and faculty and work in the community, in the university community, to talk about what we need to help people find in terms of social justice. And it's been a real rewarding experience. This is on the right is our University Museum. It's part of the original campus building, John Sutton Hall. And it's been a lot of fun to work with our students and alumni and our faculty to really find new ways to engage with our students about talking about the Social Justice Project. There have been a lot of grant-funded projects that have really helped. The Pennsylvania, the PHMC HARC grant really helped us focus on. So we've become committed to looking for and digitizing oral history interviews and documentation about African American women, especially those working in the Jeanette Glass Company in Jeanette, Pennsylvania, which is Western Pennsylvania. The that grant really opened my eyes to the problems that we have with audio video materials, and I've made a real commitment to digitize all of our audio cassettes, video cassettes, and film. And it's been a genuine challenge, I have to tell you. For the last 5 years, this project has really helped me understand the limitations that we have and the expectations that our students have of because everyone wants to have those things immediately available. Why aren't these videos and audio files already digitized? Why aren't they available on the streaming? And the truth is that they were on their original formats, which are really problematic. If anyone's ever used a U-matic tape, it's a little barbaric compared to a digital file that's you can just send by email. There's a lot of different complexities in the audio video collections. We also during COVID, we received a mini grant to conduct oral history interviews with students, employees, and the community. And this was really a fantastic opportunity to talk about how COVID has impacted our lives. And we interviewed more than 50 people, and those interviews will be transcribed and available, as well as, and there's a combination of both audio and video that we've also contributed to YouTube. So there's a lot of different ways to get information out there, to be proactive and share your thoughts about how we can make collections and social justice projects more readily available to everyone. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this is manuscript group 76. On the right and the middle, you'll see some of the audio cassette tapes that were in this collection. This grant helped us pay undergraduates and graduate students to digitize supporting documentation as well as convert oral history interviews. It also purchased a workstation that has been very helpful for scanning. The audio cassette tapes, I did a survey of what we have in the collection of audio and video recordings. And I determined that there were 5,500 audio cassette tapes, which are fairly easy to convert to MP3 files and WAV files. The next step was to be able to provide access to these, but the important thing is that all of our audio cassette tapes have now been converted and are readily available. No one needs to listen to them on a cassette player. How many of those really still exist in your collection as available? But we had 5,500 tapes, and this does not include the video, which was a whole nother problem. But it helped me realize the problem that we have of technological obsolescence and looking for a genetic industry. It's been it, we also the collection of document.
Okay, so not sure. I think we lost Harrison. Well, Dr. Wick. I just want to say, okay, yeah, hopefully you all can hear me now. I just want to mention too that if you have any questions about this presentation, you can put them in the question and answer where you're asking questions right now. So that's great. Um, okay. All right.
Looks like we still lost Harrison, but that's all right.
Um,
Would you
he
like
had
to share
one.
the screen?
Yes, you can start.
All right, so hi everyone. My name's Amber Lawrence. You probably heard a bit about me from Harrison. I just want to say thank you all for having me on this great morning. I'm 2 hours behind in Arizona, so it's great to be here with all of you. I'm going to dive a bit deeper into the social justice project, just to give you an idea of what the process was for me as a student, and also maybe you'll learn something from it. I think it's pretty cool, and so does Harrison. He talked a lot about it. So about, I think 3 years now, I originally went to the special collections just to talk about archival research in general and possible document analysis. I had no intention of starting a huge project. I was just genuinely curious for my own research. I have my master's and bachelor's in sociology. And after I started talking to Harrison about social justice, diversity, equity, inclusion, he gave me a position to start working on what we now know as the Social Justice Project. So he went into detail, but I'm going to give you a bit more of a rundown. So the initial goal was to make basically a gigantic guide or finding aid for students or other professors possibly that would want to find documentation or memorabilia for research purposes or just in general that may pertain to social justice. So as Harrison said, we have many collections and different types of manuscript and record groups. My job was to go online to our catalog, and I pulled from every single one of them. It took a lot of time. It took months to do. And at the end, I had about a 563-page document just compiled from everything in the archives that might pertain to social justice that could help as a finding aid or a guide. And as you mentioned, it is now record group 148. I have it on the right side of the screen, highlighted in yellow. And I'm really proud of this. So anyone could go visit the IUP website into the library. And if you search up the record groups, and you scroll all the way down to the bottom, it is the 148th collection, which is really cool. So now that we gave a little insight of that, what is social justice? I think it's really important to talk about it. It's not just a buzzword. In fact, I think it's more crucial than ever to actually understand its importance. But to do that, we have to understand what it is first. So definitions tend to vary on it, but I think the United Nations has probably the best definition, which is the view that everyone deserves equal economic, political, and social rights and opportunities. So keep that in mind as I go through the rest of this. So now that we know what it is, why is it important? So social justice has contributed to so many major historical events in our society, starting from the 13th Amendment in 1865 that abolished slavery, the early 1900s with the women's suffrage movement that took America by storm. And then, of course, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which helped implement the 14th and 15th Amendment and stated that no individual should be receiving discrimination against them regardless, race, sex, religion, national or origin. And again, we had things like Stonewall in the 1960s, late 1960s, and then by the early 1970s, we had the environmental justice movement, sustainability movements, the Disabilities Rights Act too. So all of this happened because people wanted to have equal freedoms, equal rights. And I think it's really important because it helps us from staying frozen in time. It really helps us progress as a society, wanting to change for the better. So what's next for the social justice project now? When I was, I believe, a graduate student is when we started to transition more. Because once the finding aid was completed for the social justice project, we brainstormed other ideas that could contribute and build onto it. Harrison mentioned a lot of them. And since social justice is like this ever continuing battle, we came up with some really good project ideas that I'd like to share. So current projects, past and current, people are still working on them, but I like to call this the second edition of the social justice project, which Harrison already mentioned, library databases. And that's what this part would really focus on. We wanted to hone in on newspapers and other literature and media sources, not just in the archives, but in IUP's library in general. And for anyone, once again, who's doing research or just curious, wants to find a book or outlet, this would be a good separate document for them too. So mention key terms for this, because when you go on to any of the library databases at IUP, you will get thousands and thousands of results. So to help narrow that down, this is where the key terms really do come into play. I narrowed down about 39 words that pertain to social justice to help us in the process. So what we would do is we go into the library database and then we would type in one of the words. I believe the first word was ableism because it went in alphabetical order. So there's also things like equality, prejudice, racism, sexism on there, xenophobia, all of these different words that pertain to social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion, just to help narrow it down and make the search a lot easier. And then I handed that part off to a different student at the time because I started to focus on a different issue, which I think deserves just as much recognition, which is the Carlisle Industrial School that was in Pennsylvania. So fair warning before I get into this, the history is pretty dark. So Carlisle was a boarding school for Native American children. And if you're not familiar with these types of schools, they were a way to try and assimilate Native children into American society and into the dominant culture. They were often abusive and repressive, and it really stripped any heritage and spirituality of Native students and any identity that they had. So it's very tragic. And Carlisle was open from the early or late 1870s to like the early 1900s. So I think about like 1910. So about 40 years that was operating. But fortunately, some of the Carlisle students that did make it out, they went on to further their education. And we found out that some of them even went to Indiana State Normal School, which, aka IUP. So our mission then became to try and find and identify, just like Harrison said, for students, now we're trying to identify Indigenous students from Carlisle that may have faced a lot of oppression and adversity, but still made it on to graduate with a college education from IUP. So this also took me months, as does everything when coming to social justice and the project itself. But this is really where it kicked off, was with the first known student that Harrison brought to me. His name is John B. Warren. And according to the National Archives, John actually attended Carlisle in 1897. He left in 1902. And between 1902 to 1914, sometime, he was at Indiana State Normal School. Because of documentations being so old, like the catalog and stuff not having as much resources, we don't know the exact date, but they did confirm that he was a student at both Carlisle and Indiana State Normal School. And John is also a board member of the Chippewa Nation. I have a little map history over here of the Ojibwe or Chippewa Nation, and where historically they were seen in North America. Just give some idea of the historical areas. So then this was the most exciting part, is that there was another student named Elmer B. Simon, who was the first student that I actually found and could confirm, in fact, did go to both Carlisle and Indiana State Normal School. So I was really excited about this, but I think it took over 2 months to find one. After searching all the commencement programs and graduate documentation to then student cards and things on Carlisle, it took a lot of time, but if you can see on the right-hand side, we have the 99 commencement program. And I remember looking down, and on the right side of it are all of the hometowns, and then left side's the names. And right at the bottom, if you can see highlighted in yellow, we have Elmer B. Simon, and his hometown was Carlisle. So that was the first time I ever saw anyone listed their hometown as Carlisle in all of these old commencement programs. So that prompted me to go onto Carlisle's website, also into the National Archives, and I did in fact find that he is the same person. He entered Carlisle in 1889 and departed in about 1896. And then he graduated. He went straight to Indiana State Normal School right afterwards and graduated in 1899. And interestingly enough, he went to hardware afterwards, and he was in Johnstown, Pennsylvania for, I would say, a few years before moving to Chicago, Illinois. So, along with the known students, this one was actually really fascinating because I was just looking for students at the time. I wasn't actually looking for faculty. I didn't think to until I came upon Frank Mount Pleasant, which this is really exciting because not only did Frank go to Carlisle, but he also was an Olympian. And he and Jim Thorpe, a good friend of his, both went to the 1912 Olympics, and they both competed too. Jim Thorpe, if you don't know, he was one of the first indigenous athletes to win gold at the Olympics, also from Pennsylvania. And he went to Carlisle too, I believe. But Frank was there too. And although he didn't win gold, he did get fifth place in, I believe, the broad jump, which is really cool. And after that, he then came to Indiana State Normal School, and he coached about 3 seasons of football, which that is exciting that not only did we have a student from Carlisle come to Indiana State Normal School, but also an Olympian that did, which I think that's some really cool piece of history. Now, with the successes, we had a bit of setbacks, which is because, like Harrison said, like catalogs being so old and not having proper visual evidence, it became really difficult to try and figure out if certain people were the same person. A lot of the Carlisle Industrial School students did not have their picture. I had to go off of just student cards and dates and names, addresses. So that's why it took the longest, I believe, because even if there was a similar name around the same time period, it's really hard to confirm if they're the same person. So two examples of that are Sarah Nelson from the Shawnee Nation and Eliza Johnson from the Caddo Nation. So Sarah Nelson, she was in Carlisle until 1888. And then we have records of another woman named Sarah Nelson that graduated in 1892. We cannot confirm based on addresses. There wasn't anything listed because they were such old documentations. Things were faded. It's really hard to tell if they are the same person, but this is a possible student as well. We can't confirm or deny. And same with Eliza Johnson too from the Caddo Nation. She was graduating from Carlisle in 1894, and then there was another girl in 1897 from Indiana State Normal School. Now, the biggest setback I think I had was Jenny Mitchell. At first, I did think Jenny Mitchell was the same person. The dates were pretty close together, and the addresses weren't too far apart either. However, I determined that it was not once I looked back at the student card again, and when I saw why Jenny Mitchell left, unfortunately, she was deathly ill. So they are not the same person just because she most likely did not live on during the time period. So unfortunately, we did not find another student, but I just wanted to mention her just in general, because I think it's also a good idea to bring awareness to just how many students also had to leave Carlisle because they were deathly ill, or weren't being treated right. So just as a little side. But other than that, I kept busy with a lot of other projects. Harrison mentioned the digitization. I spent months also digitizing VHS tapes along with my colleagues that were doing the audio cassette tapes. I believe I digitized about 500 VHS tapes during that time period of, I think, 5-6 months. So while doing all of that and looking out for collections that might involve social justice there, I was also on the PA 150 grant that Harrison mentioned, which in terms of outreach in the University Museum, this is really important because a colleague and I, we were both given 10 text panels. Mine pertains specifically to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So once again, tying into the social justice projects. And we had panels based on women's basketball. I did one on LGBTQIA support, distinguished alumni. I tried to get a wide range and variation of alumni that have all different types of backgrounds too and successes. And then, of course, the history of Black students. I know Bianca Parker was already mentioned, but she was our first African American student, and I did a panel on her too. So I think that's always important to mention. And all of this, once again, for outreach purposes, these brochures and text panels will be in the University Museum in fall 2025. So then anyone, and even just visitors to campus, could go into the University Museum and see all of this pertaining to social justice, maybe get some ideas, maybe learn a few things too, or just think differently about the world. So that is all I have for everyone today. I hope I didn't ramble on too much. But yeah, that's pretty much the social justice project in general. And I hope I was able to give a better idea to everyone, the process of going through something like this, and also shed light on some more difficult topics to talk about. And I think Brother Joshua will be presenting next too.
Yes, he should be joining shortly. Just bear with us a moment.
Hello, I am Joshua Waits. I am the archivist for Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria, Virginia, and it is a pleasure to be with you this morning. Just to give a little bit of background, I have a master's degree in American religious history, also specializing in material culture and archives and museum management. I did not come to Virginia Theological Seminary originally to be the archivist here. I actually came to be a seminarian and to be a student. And while I was here, I was working in the library on their African American collection when the archivist moved on to another position elsewhere, and found myself shortly thereafter being courted to become the archivist here at the seminary. So just to give some information on our holdings, we have three main areas of focus at our archive. One is the VTS institutional records, which are divided into 30 smaller collections ranging from the Board of Trustees and the deans to faculty to publications, student records, all of the stuff about the administration and history of the institution. We also have our manuscript collection, which has 286 record groups within it that cover anything that involves someone with a relationship to the seminary, be they alumni, individual trustee members, former faculty, research collections, those who have done research at the seminary, those types of things. Then we also partner with the Historical Society of the Episcopal Church to do a special collection called the African American Episcopal Historical Collection, which has 114 record groups within it, which celebrated its 20th anniversary just last year in October of 2023. And it is designed to uplift and preserve the historical contributions of Black people to the Episcopal Church, the larger Christian community, as well as international events such as fighting apartheid in South Africa or the AIDS crisis across the world. On average, we receive between 550 and 600 research inquiries every single year. We also have travel grant programs for those who wish to do research in our African American historical collection. Now, when I first came to Virginia Theological Seminary as a student, they had already announced a reparations project, becoming one of the first institutions to actively try to engage itself in this particular form of social justice. The reparations project was announced on September 5th of 2019 with very specific initiative goals, particularly to build relationships with the descendants of those who had worked on the seminary campus, both during the times of slavery as enslaved individuals and those who had worked at Virginia Theological Seminary during the Jim Crow era. It wanted to ensure that the seminary was preserving these people's history, including it as part of the seminary's history, and providing for the descendants disbursements from their reparation fund. Additionally, it wanted to seek to build relationships with two particular African American congregations, the Meade Memorial Episcopal Church, which was founded by people who had worked on at the seminary, and the Oakland Baptist Church, which is located just down the street from the seminary. And many of the African American people who had worked at the seminary were members of that congregation, and seminarians had also assisted in building that particular building. Another initiative was to support African American alums who work in historically Black congregations, to raise up African Americans to be trained for leadership, both in the ordained ministries and in other forms of leadership within Episcopal congregations and within the context of the larger world, and to support projects related to racial and social justice. When I came to Virginia Theological Seminary as a student, the then archivist, my predecessor, gave a presentation on the history of the seminary and about the reparations program. I was excited to see that the seminary was being a forerunner in areas of social justice when it comes to institutional discrimination. After his presentation, I went up to him as a student and asked him, had there been any research or holdings done in the archives about the seminary's exclusion and then eventual inclusion of LGBTQIA plus individuals. He informed me that there was material in the archives, but no one had made a concerted effort to create a collection or highlight those parts of the collection that were connected to LGBT rights. As I continued my studies, that absence continued to build in my mind. And once I became the archivist, I realized that it was my job to build upon the work done by my predecessors in the reparations project and to begin to highlight the voices of queer identifying people that had been both excluded and included at Virginia Theological Seminary. To go about this, we launched the Called and Holy LGBTQ Oral History Project, so named after the decision and policy that was instituted in 1997 by the seminary called A Call to a Holy Living. The purpose of the project was to identify LGBTQ individuals who had been involved with the institution, craft a relationship built on empathy and trust, and add their stories to the larger seminary archive. Additionally, we were wanting to expand the institutional memory and history to include these voices, and we wanted to support the various LGBTQ plus alums in their various vocations, ministries, and work, and advocate for individual reconciliation for people who had been personally affected by the discrimination of the seminary. Our final goal was to engage faculty and students with the archived material, with the oral histories, in order to further academic research and social justice work in the public sector. In doing this, we came to find that there were certain ways that we were expanding the narrative of Virginia Theological Seminary, ways that showed intersections of both policy, culture, and personal narrative. The first major thing was during the 1960s and 70s, in which the seminary operated out of a policy of exclusion based on science. In the 1970s, the Episcopal Church, as well as VTS, deemed homosexuality as a pathological condition and based their opinions on the DSM-1 classifications. In 1971, the seminary released a policy stating that those who they found to be homosexuals should be recommended for psychotherapy and celibacy, and refraining from engaging in any type of lifestyle that they deemed morally unfit. They rejected the idea that homosexual relationships could be fateful and lifelong partnerships. The reason for this was their theological justification of the Christian understanding of sexuality and upheld heterosexual relationships as lifelong and monogamous. In going through and trying to expand the history, we found that the oral history shed new light on what the policies did to individuals. Such was the case of Don Shambley, who is pictured here with his class of 1973, who, when this policy was enacted, instantly began to express fear and trepidation amongst rumors and accusations that were being hurled by classmates against fellow classmates. In his oral history, he talks about the impact of the 1971 policy on his life and sense of security, resulting in him abandoning the seminary, leaving his believed vocation to the ordained ministry, and eventually losing his own religious faith. As time moved on, things began to change at the seminary, and exclusion began to take on an exclusion based on tradition. By 1976, the General Convention of the Episcopal Church had ruled that homosexuals were to be viewed as children of God, and therefore abandoned the psychological, pathological wording of their prohibitions against homosexuality, while still not allowing homosexuals to be ordained or receive any of the sacraments of the church. So in 1977, VTS revised its policy, focusing on behavior rather than orientation, and expanded it to include both faculty as well as students. This reflected the larger debates within the Episcopal Church, and as well as emerging activism within the Episcopal Church, such organizations as Integrity, which fought for better inclusion. During this time, a gentleman by the name of Harry Stocks attended VTS, who gave his oral history and talked about how he was very open about his sexuality while he was a student at VTS. However, when it came down to his final days at the seminary, 1 week before his graduation, the faculty refused to recommend him for ordination, meaning that he would receive a Master's of Divinity from the seminary, but would not be allowed to be ordained in the Episcopal Church. The harsh consequences of this led to him to having a life full of financial hardships and personal struggles, eventually having to enter the realm of exotic dancing in order to pay bills. Eventually, he had an advocate in the name of a Reverend Wilbur, who basically came and forced the seminary to revise its decision, allowing him to be ordained. However, in 1987, he would be removed from the priesthood due to his declaring of his love for his partner now of 41 years. As the 1980s rolled on, BTS began to experience the ongoing debate in the national church. In 1979, the Episcopal Church declared that homosexuality was no barrier to ordination provided that people remained celibate. Therefore, BTS in 1981 changed its policy once again to make clear distinctions between orientation and behavior, but continued its institutional challenges for openly queer clergy, particularly for faculty and supervisors of seminarians, including field supervisors whom they declared to be adjunct faculty. I took the oral history of the Reverend Jerry Anderson, who was the first man to come out of the closet as a priest in the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, D.C. 1 week after he had announced that he was an openly gay man, the director of field education at BTS visited him at his church to inform him that he would no longer be allowed to supervise students who were trying to do their field education. The conflict with BTS's field education policy exposed a fear of public exposure for both Reverend Anderson as well as the Bishop of the Diocese of Washington. Jerry Anderson reports that he had to navigate personal and institutional expectations in order to survive as an openly gay man in the 1980s. Then, with the beginning of the AIDS crisis, he found himself entering into a new ministry, becoming the first person to found a ministry to people dying with AIDS in the Episcopal Church, the Episcopal Caring Response to AIDS from the Diocese of Washington, D.C. The 1990s saw a major shift in Virginia Theological Seminary. A new dean came into a position of authority. In the 1990s, a new dean came to Virginia Theological Seminary named Martha Horn. She was the first woman to hold this position, one of the early women to be ordained in the Episcopal Church. And she sought to change VTS's policies to be more inclusive. In 1996, she began to engage the faculty of VTS in debates and publications addressing homosexuality in theology. Particularly wanting to challenge the 1981 policy. After much debate in 1997, the seminary decided to adopt a policy called a Call to a Holy Life, which began the initial steps towards inclusivity. It no longer required seminarians or faculty to be celibate if they were homosexuals. It encouraged people to be in faithful, committed relationships and would engage people in education toward the ordained ministry, even if they identified as LGBTQ. Much of this came to a head in 2003 when the seminary hired its first faculty member who was an openly partnered lesbian, the Dr. Ruth Anna Hook. There was open opposition, particularly from conservative students, to her being added to the faculty. There were many debates held on campus, but Martha Horn, the dean, held strong that this was the path that the seminary was choosing. In her oral history, Ruth Anna Hook describes how this opposition from students affected her, but it also increased her resolve not to defend her sexuality, and how she gained support from allies, including those who had initially been opposed to her hiring. The final effects of this project has been that it has moved from a position of oral history into a position of social justice. Students have begun to use the oral history collections for research, including trying to identify students who have died of AIDS, student research on the queer history of the seminary, and a student-led effort for a Trans Remembrance Day display in the library. Other departments of the seminary are engaging with the oral history project, including the continuing education department, lifelong learning, which held a webinar in which I facilitated a conversation between Jerry Anderson, who founded the Episcopal Caring Response for AIDS, and Riley Temple, the president of the Whitman Walker's AIDS Clinic. Additionally, the oral history project has led to the current dean of the seminary awarding Jerry Anderson the Dean's Cross Award for leadership in a symbol of solidarity and apology for treatment of the seminary. Additionally, the Reverend Harry Stock has been reinstalled as a priest in the Episcopal Church after his bishop heard his story reported to him by people who knew of the oral history project. At that reinstallation of Harry Stock, Dean Ian Markham, the Dean of Virginia Theological Seminary, issued a public apology to all those who identify as LGBTQ+, whom the seminary had hurt. These efforts are just the beginnings of what we see developing into a larger movement of reconciliation and reparations for LGBT queer people, built on the initial projects of reparations and reconciliation that Virginia Theological Seminary has been engaging in with those marginalized communities that it has harmed in the past. Thank you, and I will turn it back over to Jacqueline.
All right, so thank you all for your presentation. So we could go into the Q&A now. I don't know if you guys want to join me in the webinar so that you could answer the questions. So our first question says, congratulations on identifying these students and increasing awareness of marginalized groups. Does anyone have examples working with faculty to incorporate them into assignments or a paper, outreach or promotion beyond exhibits, etc.?
I can talk about the bibliographic instruction that I've worked with of departments in history, philosophy, religious studies, even foreign languages. It's been a lot of fun to work with our faculty to try to integrate and reach our students. It's been a lot of work too, because if anything, we have to, with the social justice project, we have to go back in, and it's kind of reverse research when it comes down to it, because we know about students, but then we have to go and find primary sources about them.
We are finding that our history faculty, particularly those who teach the history of the Episcopal Church, are sending students to us to engage with our various holdings, but particularly the oral history collections, to try and craft their history research papers to expand the conversations that students are having about both the founding and the social justice work of the denomination.
Yeah, just to add that, not faculty, but a lot of students when I was still a graduate student at IUP, I actually knew one of the people that came into the archives to work for Harrison. And I told them about the social justice project, and they are the one that also hopped on the newspaper. So it's kind of cool that just outreach within students to being able to tell them and getting them interested in it.
Muted. Okay, thank you for answering those the questions. I guess I do have a question, I think specifically for you, Amber, because your work does resonate with me. There's a similar project I want to embark on myself where I work, focusing on the women that were employed at the university where I work, because we don't hear much about them because someone had to do washing and all of that, and we don't know who these women were. So I'd love to go back and do that. But you said you searched like the programs for people's names. Now, did you have to do that with physical copies, or were you able to search like a digitized file?
Luckily, because we have been pushing for digitization, I think all of our archival groups, at least the finding aid, is digitized. But I also looked at commencement programs too for graduate students. So anything that is digitized, I was able to get my hands on, I looked at, but I also did go through some archival and like record group and manuscript groups too. So I also recommend that. Some of these were very, very old and were disintegrating in my hands, but it's better to try and find any copy than no copy. So I think both is actually better, like going in person, physically looking through, but also utilizing digitization when we have it.
Okay.
That makes a big difference. I mean, digitization has just changed everything. Problem is, there's some records we just can't because they're too fragile. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure Brother Joshua's running the same thing. The older things get, the one of the collections we received fairly recently was some photographs of these are so that these included housekeeping employees and housekeeping and food prep for campus back in about the 1920s. And there just was not a lot of documentation. We have names now, a couple images. Those were found after the most recent IUP history was published. And as a result of the social justice project, here we are getting some firsthand information that we just didn't have before.
Yeah, and also to add on to that, especially with women, Harrison might have to correct me if I'm wrong, but when I was looking into like women's sports too, for the panels I was writing, especially women's basketball, we ran into a lot of issues because these happened in like the early 1900s, that there were some documentation of women's sports, but they eventually got fizzled out throughout time. So there's about like a 20-year gap between the first real like women's basketball or like women's sports team at IUP versus like the official ones that we know now. And a lot of that is just because of, misogyny, things being fizzled out, also just not proper documentation either. So that's also an issue I ran into, but I was able to utilize both the actual physical copies of the archives and the documentation online.
That's been yeah, that's been a big problem. It's very funny. I'm working on the new videos for basketball in particular, and women's basketball was very tough to document because we have it now. We have all, the last 10 years have been all new files, MP4s, easy to manipulate and email and share. Previous before that, I mean, we're lucky to go back another 20 years with tape, but it's very challenging. And not to mention, don't get me started on CDs and tapes just as bad, because it may not be very well identified. So you really don't know what you're looking at, except for the fact that you can access it because you converted it to an MP4 file, but it's challenging.
Also, a major difficulty that I run into is, and this is in regards both to our reparations program and with the LGBT histories as well, is that so often people's stories were so silenced that there is nothing to digitize and document. Particularly for the LGBT Oral History Project, for people that were here at the seminary in the 1940s and 50s, there will be no records that I can find because they would never have actually publicly declared anything. And so the only thing you can do is do conjecture. And even going into even with finding people to speak to their stories in the 1970s, the difficulty with that is finding people that are willing to share their experiences, because particularly if they've experienced some sort of traumatic experience with the institution, they don't wish to relive that and rehash that. So you run into the fact that sometimes you can't digitize records because the records don't exist. And so what you have to do then is what I have found to do is to try to preserve those things that point to something, even if it isn't a conclusive thing.
So we do have to wrap up. We're about a minute over. I just want to say thank you all for your presentation. And yeah, and questions and answering our questions. And I hope you and everyone else all enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was good to see everyone.
Mhm.